In the 1st century, a Jewish rabbi from Israel began a movement that he said was the fulfillment of the Torah and the prophets, the ancient scriptures of his people. Jesus of Nazareth announced this good news among the weak, the suffering, and the poor, among those longing for a world made right. He called people into a life of radical peace and open-handed generosity. And he described this movement as the coming of the kingdom of the skies. So what exactly did Jesus mean by the kingdom of the skies? In the Bible, the skies are the great image of God's realm, the place where his rule is whole, where life, justice, and peace fully reign. So when heaven comes to earth, it means God's goodness confronting and overcoming death, evil, and violence here in our world. In fact, this is how the biblical story begins, right, with the Garden of Eden. Yes, humanity walking with God in the garden, living in his presence, receiving life from him, and building a home together. That is the true human calling. But there was also a way out of the garden, a road leading away from God's life. Why would anyone choose that? Because a deceitful creature appeared and convinced the humans that God could not be trusted, and that the good life could be seized by taking an easier road. But that road leads to ruin, violence, and death. Exactly. So the Torah and the prophets tell the story of God choosing one family, Israel, and giving them his Torah, his instruction, so they could find their way back into his presence. He taught them how to build homes and communities where he could dwell among them once again. And through that life together, they were meant to show the nations the way back to God. But even with God's instruction, Israel also fell for deception and turned aside. Yes, they were misled by corrupt prophets and leaders who claimed to speak for God. Ezekiel called them wolves, people who do not only go astray themselves, but also drag others down the same path. So now Jesus is saying that God's kingdom has arrived in and through him. Yes, Jesus is gathering a renewed Israel, a people who will choose the right path. They will reject deception and build something lasting if they answer his call. So in the final section of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus lays out a decision. Enter through the narrow gate. Wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many go through it. But narrow is the gate and hard is the road that leads to life, and few find it. Jesus wants there to be no confusion. The path to life is not the easy one. It can feel restrictive. It can involve pressure, hardship, and testing. But in truth, it is the road that leads to real freedom. So there will be people trying to pull us off that road? Yes. Jesus goes on to say, beware of false prophets. They come to you dressed like sheep, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. But if they look harmless, how do you know who they really are? Jesus says to watch the fruit of their lives. Do their choices produce life, healing, justice, and faithfulness? Or do they leave behind harm and destruction? By their fruit you will recognize them. So fruit means the result of a person's way of living. Exactly. If someone's life keeps producing rotten fruit, that kind of life cannot remain in God's new world. But life is complicated. A person can look good on the outside. They can fool others, maybe even fool themselves. For a time, yes, but not God. Jesus says, many will say to me on that day, Master, Master, did we not prophesy in your name, cast out demons in your name, and do mighty works in your name? And then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. So it is possible to imitate the works of Jesus and still not truly belong to him? Yes, Jesus has already warned that even good actions can be done for the wrong reasons. When our outward behavior is disconnected from a transformed heart, we miss the real life he offers. A real relationship with Jesus himself? Yes, Jesus is not only giving moral advice, he is placing before us a decision about him. Will we receive his words and let him reshape our lives into the ways of God? And that leads to the next image he gives. Where will we build our house? On sand or on rock? It sounds simple, but it is not random. In the Hebrew scriptures, the house of God is the temple, the place where God's presence dwells, built on the hill of Jerusalem. So Jesus is speaking about more than private spirituality. He is describing the building of a people, a community where God's heavenly presence can dwell on earth again, like Eden restored. So everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came, the floods rose, the winds struck that house, but it did not collapse because its foundation was on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came, the floods rose, the winds struck that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. So Jesus is calling people to build places where God can dwell, where Eden begins to bloom again, because those are the only things that will endure. Exactly. And just as he said at the beginning of the sermon, a city on a hill cannot be hidden. So let that light shine before everyone. Jesus is describing a new kind of humanity, a people living by God's wisdom and love, forming communities of peace and justice in a world full of violence, fear, and death. Throughout the Sermon on the Mount, he gives us a bold picture of what that life can be. And in the rest of his own life, Jesus embodied that vision completely. Then he placed the same choice before his followers. And now that choice stands before us.